The first wave of Grumman Wildcats screamed across the Pacific dawn like vengeful spirits, their engines roaring defiance against the rising sun. Commander Wade McCluskey gripped his control stick with white knuckles as he led his squadron toward the Japanese fleet, knowing that the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance on this 4th day of June, 1940. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's grand strategy had seemed flawless on paper. The Japanese combined fleet, with its 4 aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and here you would strike the American base at Midway Atoll, drawing the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where superior numbers would crush American resistance once and for all. The attack would serve as both a strategic victory and revenge for the humiliating Doolittle raid on Tokyo 2 months earlier. But as the morning sun painted the ocean gold, the carefully orchestrated Japanese plan began to unravel like a silk kimono caught on barbed wire. The Americans, through their incredible code-breaking efforts led by Commander Joseph Rochefort's team at Station Hypo, had penetrated the Japanese naval cipher known as JN-25. Every move, every position, every timing of the Japanese fleet was known to Admiral Chester Nimitz and his commanders. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier strike force, had divided his attention between the planned assault on Midway and the possibility of American naval forces in the area. His pilots had launched their first wave against the atoll at dawn, expecting to find surprised defenders. Instead, they encountered fierce resistance from Marine fighters and anti-aircraft batteries that had been prepared for their arrival. The radio crackled with urgent reports from the returning Japanese pilots. Midway defenses stronger than expected. Came the transmission from Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukuda's strike group. Second attack wave required. The words struck Nagumo like a physical blow. His carefully timed schedule was already falling behind. Meanwhile, on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay prepared his torpedo squadron for what would become one of the most crucial attacks in naval history. The morning air was thick with tension as mechanics made final adjustments to the TBD Devastator aircraft, their obsolete frames seeming fragile against the magnitude of their mission. As referenced in Walter Lord's comprehensive account Incredible Victory, the American forces at Midway had been reinforced with every available aircraft, creating a defensive network that would prove far more resilient than Japanese intelligence had predicted. The Japanese carriers, steaming in their diamond formation 24 miles northwest of Midway, began receiving the first wave of American attacks at precisely 7:35 a.m. The sight that greeted the Japanese lookouts was terrifying in its determination. Wave after wave of American aircraft diving through the morning sky, their wings glinting like silver blades in the sunlight. Nagumo faced an impossible decision. His second wave aircraft were armed with land attack bombs for the planned follow-up strike on Midway, but reports of American ships in the area meant he needed to rearm them with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for naval combat. The rearming process would take precious time, leaving his carriers vulnerable during the critical window when American aircraft were approaching. The thunder of anti-aircraft guns filled the air as the first American torpedo bombers pressed their attacks home with suicidal courage, their aircraft disintegrating under the withering Japanese defensive fire, yet continuing their runs with a determination that would echo through history. The flight decks of the Japanese carriers became scenes of controlled chaos as Nagumo's fateful decision to rearm his aircraft created a deadly vulnerability. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered across the hangar decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu while frantic ordnance crews worked to swap the weapons systems. The carefully maintained Japanese naval discipline was beginning to fray under the pressure of simultaneous threats from multiple directions. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his torpedo squadron 8 from the USS Hornet in a desperate attack against the Japanese fleet. The obsolete TBD Devastators, flying at wavetop level, were sitting ducks for the Japanese Zero fighters that dove upon them like hawks. One by one, the American torpedo bombers fell into the Pacific, their crews making the ultimate sacrifice without scoring a single hit on the enemy carriers. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, led by veteran pilots like Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, had been drawn down to sea level by the torpedo attacks. The Zeros, despite their superior maneuverability, were running low on fuel and ammunition after the sustained combat. More critically, they were out of position for what was about to unfold in the skies above. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto stood on the bridge of Soryu, watching the American torpedo planes press their attacks with what he could only describe as magnificent courage. Despite the tactical victory of shooting down nearly all the attacking aircraft, an uneasy feeling gnawed at him. The Americans were fighting with a desperation that suggested they knew something the Japanese did not. At 9:20 a.m., the situation aboard the Japanese carriers reached a critical point. The rearming process was nearly complete, but the constant American attacks had delayed the launch of the second wave against Midway. Worse, scout planes had finally confirmed the presence of American carriers in the area. Validation of Nagumo's worst fears. The radio operator aboard Akagi received an urgent transmission from Chief Petty Officer Kiyoshi. In reconnaissance plane number 4, enemy fleet includes what appears to be a carrier. Bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The news sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure. Nagumo's Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, urged immediate action. "We must strike the American carriers before they can launch a coordinated attack," he insisted, his voice tight with urgency. But the Japanese aircraft were still being rearmed, and the continuous American raids had disrupted the careful timing that was essential to carrier operations. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, flying his SBD Dauntless dive bomber from Enterprise, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour. Fuel was running critically low, and several of his pilots had already turned back. Then, through the morning haze, he spotted the white wake of a Japanese destroyer heading northeast at high speed. The vessel was the Arashi, racing to rejoin the main fleet after dropping depth charges on the American submarine. Nautilus, following the destroyer's wake like a highway in the sky. McCluskey's squadron crested a cloud layer at 14,000 feet and saw spread below them the most magnificent naval target in military history. For Japanese aircraft carriers, their flight decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, steamed in perfect formation, completely exposed to attack. The timing was nothing short of miraculous. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol was at sea level, chasing the last of the torpedo bombers. The carrier decks were cluttered with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. The ships were at their most vulnerable moment, caught between defensive and offensive operations. McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio, "Attack immediately. All squadrons, attack immediately." The words marked the beginning of the most decisive 5 minutes in naval aviation history. As the American dive bombers pushed over into their attack runs, the carefully planned Japanese offensive began its transformation into a desperate struggle for survival. The morning sun, which had risen on Japanese confidence and American determination, now witnessed the moment when the tide of the Pacific War would turn forever. The screaming dive of 37 SBD Dauntless bombers marked the beginning of what naval historians would later call the miracle at Midway. At precisely 10:22 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the course of the Pacific War shifted in the span of 5 devastating minutes. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's Enterprise Air Group plunged through the morning sky like avenging angels, their 1,000-pound bombs aimed at the heart of the Japanese carrier fleet. Below them, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy lay exposed and vulnerable, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, fuel, and ordnance that would soon become instruments of their own destruction. The first bomb struck the Kaga with a sound, like thunder splitting the earth. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, leading his squadron in a near-vertical dive, scored a direct hit on the carrier's flight deck near the island structure. The explosion sent a column of flame and debris skyward, instantly transforming the ship from a weapon of war into a blazing pyre. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadrons from the USS Yorktown joined the attack on Soryu. The carrier, named for the ancient province of Yamashiro, had been the pride of the Japanese fleet. Within minutes, 3 bombs had torn through her flight deck, igniting the armed aircraft waiting for launch. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto, trapped on his burning bridge, chose to go down with his ship rather than abandon his post. The human cost of the battle continued to influence both sides long after the guns fell silent. The Japanese families, who had lost sons and husbands in the carrier battles, were told only that their loved ones had died gloriously in service to the emperor. The true circumstances of their deaths remained a closely guarded secret that would not be revealed until after the war's end. American families, meanwhile, celebrated their sons' heroism while mourning their losses. The crew of Torpedo Squadron 8, which had been virtually annihilated in their attack on the Japanese carriers, became symbols of the courage and sacrifice required to defeat fascism. Their story would be told and retold throughout the war as inspiration for subsequent generations of American servicemen. The strategic lessons of Midway influenced military thinking. Far beyond the Pacific theater, the demonstrated effectiveness of carrier aviation convinced military leaders worldwide that naval warfare had been permanently transformed. The battleship, symbol of naval power for nearly a century, had been relegated to a supporting role in favor of the aircraft carrier. As documented in the official Japanese war history Senshi Sosho, the defeat at Midway marked the beginning of Japan's inevitable retreat across the Pacific. The initiative, seized so dramatically at Pearl Harbor, had passed permanently to the Americans and their allies. Every subsequent Japanese military operation would be conducted from a position of increasing weakness. The codebreakers of Station HYPO, whose intelligence had made the victory possible, continued their vital work throughout the war. Their penetration of Japanese communications would provide crucial advantages in subsequent battles, but none would be as decisive as their contribution to the Midway victory. The Battle of Midway, fought over for days in June 1942, had lasted only 96 hours from first contact to final withdrawal, but those for days had changed the course of world history, proving that American democracy possessed the strength and determination to defeat totalitarian aggression. The Japanese plans, so carefully crafted and seemingly unstoppable, had indeed disintegrated under the weight of Midway's fierce air raids, marking the beginning of the end for the empire of the rising sun and the dawn of American victory. In the Pacific War, the scene aboard the Japanese carriers was apocalyptic. As documented in Mitsuo Fukuda's post-war memoir, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, the explosions created a chain reaction that turned the ships into floating infernos. Fuel from ruptured aircraft ignited stored ordnance, creating secondary explosions that ripped through the vessel's vital systems. Admiral Nagumo, aboard the flagship Akagi, watched in horror as his meticulously planned offensive disintegrated in a matter of minutes. The carrier that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier was now a mass of twisted metal and flame. The Admiral's flag captain, Taijiro Aoki, urged immediate evacuation as fires spread below decks toward the aviation fuel storage tanks. The only Japanese carrier to escape the initial devastation was Hiryu, positioned slightly apart from the main formation. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, the carrier's division commander, immediately ordered a counterattack with every available aircraft. "We must strike back immediately," he commanded his staff, "before the Americans can consolidate their advantage." Lieutenant Commander Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters toward the American fleet, guided by the smoke columns rising from their own burning carriers. The irony was bitter. The destruction of the Japanese fleet now served as a beacon to guide their own retaliatory strike. The American carriers had dispersed after launching their attacks, but Yorktown, commanded by Captain Elliot Buckmaster, had slowed to recover her aircraft. The ship's radar operators detected the incoming Japanese strike at 11:55 a.m., giving precious minutes to prepare for the assault. The sky above Yorktown erupted in anti-aircraft fire as the Japanese bombers pressed their attack with the same suicidal determination their enemies had shown earlier. 3 bombs struck the carrier, one penetrating to the 4th deck and causing massive damage to the ship's propulsion system. The vessel listed heavily to port, seemingly mortally wounded, but the Japanese had paid a terrible price for their revenge. Of the 18 bombers that attacked Yorktown, only 5 returned to Hiryu. The American Combat Air Patrol, led by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch's innovative Thatchweave formation, had torn through the Japanese formation with devastating effectiveness. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the strategic situation had been completely reversed. 3 of Japan's 4 aircraft carriers lay burning and sinking, their irreplaceable veteran pilots either dead or struggling in the Pacific waters. The concentrated naval aviation power that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was being consumed by flames that could be seen from 20 miles away. The Japanese plans, so carefully crafted and seemingly unstoppable, had indeed disintegrated under the weight of Midway's fierce air raids and the courage of American airmen willing to sacrifice everything for victory. The afternoon of June 4th brought no respite to the Japanese fleet, as the consequences of the morning's disaster continued to unfold with merciless precision. The 3 burning carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu had become floating monuments to the fragility of naval power, their death throes visible across the Pacific horizon. Admiral Nagumo, now aboard the light cruiser Nagara after evacuating the burning Akagi, faced the most difficult decision of his naval career. The flagship that had carried him to victory at Pearl Harbor was beyond saving, her magazines threatening to explode at any moment. Captain Taijiro Aoki, the last man to leave the ship, reported that the forward elevator had been blown completely out of its shaft, creating a gaping wound that fed oxygen to the fires below. The human cost was becoming apparent as rescue operations continued throughout the afternoon. Captain Jisaku Okada of the Kaga had been killed instantly when the first American bomb struck his ship's island structure. Throughout the Japanese fleet, veteran pilots who had trained for years and fought in China and the early Pacific campaigns were either dead or missing, their irreplaceable experience lost forever. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, aboard the still operational Hiryu, understood that his carrier represented the last hope for Japanese victory. The 50-year-old veteran, known for his aggressive tactics and innovative thinking, ordered his remaining aircraft to prepare for a final strike against the American fleet. "We must sink at least 1 American carrier," he told his staff, "or this defeat will be complete." The second Japanese attack wave, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, targeted the damaged Yorktown with 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters. The American carrier, despite heroic damage control efforts by her crew, was still listing and vulnerable at 2:45 p.m. to torpedoes struck the ship's port side, causing massive flooding that threatened to capsize the vessel. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, realizing his ship was doomed, ordered abandon ship at 3 p.m. The crew of Yorktown, many of whom had served aboard the carrier since her commissioning, reluctantly left their vessel as she rolled further to port. The sight of the abandoned carrier, her battle flag still flying, brought tears to the eyes of hardened sailors who had called her home. But the Americans were far from finished. Enterprise and Hornet, their decks crowded with aircraft returning from the morning strikes, prepared for a final assault on the last Japanese carrier. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, despite his earlier heroics, was deemed too exhausted to lead another mission. Command passed to Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher, who would guide 24 dive bombers toward Hiryu. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Gallagher's squadron located the Japanese carrier. Hiryu, desperately launching her last fighters, presented a smaller target than the morning's victims, but her fate was sealed by the same tactical mistakes that had doomed her sisters. At 5 p.m., 4 bombs struck Hiryu in quick succession. The explosions, magnified by the carrier's stored aviation fuel and ordnance, created a fireball that could be seen from 40 miles away. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, true to the samurai tradition, chose to remain aboard his burning ship rather than face the shame of defeat. As documented in the official U.S. Navy historical account, the Battle of Midway, the destruction of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in a single day, represented the most decisive naval victory in American history. The sight of the burning carriers, their steel hulls glowing like forge fires against the darkening Pacific, marked the end of Japanese naval supremacy. The strategic implications were immediately apparent to both sides. Japan had lost not only for irreplaceable carriers, but also the majority of her experienced carrier pilots. The veterans who had perfected their skills in China and the early Pacific campaigns were gone, and their replacements would never match their expertise. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato 300 miles away, received the reports with stoic resignation. The combined fleet commander who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor now faced the reality that his grand strategy had failed catastrophically. The decisive battle he had sought had indeed occurred, but the victory belonged to his enemies. The morning of June 5th dawned gray and ominous over the Pacific battlefield, where the remnants of the Japanese fleet struggled to salvage something from the catastrophic defeat. The burning hulks of 3 aircraft carriers continued to smoke on the horizon, their steel skeletons serving as tombstones for Japanese naval ambitions. The damaged Yorktown, abandoned by her crew the previous afternoon, floated like a ghost ship in the morning swells. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, watching from the destroyer Hammond, noted that his carrier had stabilized during the night and might actually be salvageable. The decision was made to attempt the unprecedented task of rayboarding an abandoned aircraft carrier in enemy waters. Lieutenant Commander Irving Wiltsey led the salvage party aboard Yorktown at dawn, his team of volunteers moving through the darkened passages like explorers in a steel cave. The carrier's magazines had been flooded as a precaution, and the ship's list had decreased to 26 degrees. For the first time since the battle began, American hopes began to rise that something might be saved from the wreckage. Meanwhile, the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the American fleet since the previous evening. The submarine, one of 25 boats deployed to support the Midway operation, had been frustrated by the speed of the American withdrawal, until the stationary Yorktown presented an irresistible target, the destroyer Hammond, tied alongside. Yorktown, to provide power and pumping capacity, created a perfect setup for Tanabe's attack. At 1:36 p.m. on June 6th, the Japanese submarine fired for torpedoes at the coupled ships from a range of 1,200 yards. The underwater missiles, trailing wakes of bubbles, raced toward their targets with mechanical precision. The first torpedo struck Hammond amidships, breaking the destroyer's back and causing her to sink in less than 4 minutes. The explosion, occurring directly beneath the ship's depth charge storage, created a massive underwater detonation that killed or wounded most of the crew still aboard. Lieutenant Commander Arnold True, the destroyer's captain, went down with his ship. 2 more torpedoes struck Yorktown on her starboard side, causing massive flooding that doomed the salvage operation. The carrier, which had survived the morning's air attacks and the previous day's torpedo strikes, finally succumbed to the submarine's assault. The ship that had fought at Coral Sea and Midway slowly rolled over and sank stern first, her battle flag disappearing beneath the Pacific waves at dawn on June 7th. The sinking of Yorktown provided a small measure of revenge for the Japanese, but it could not disguise the magnitude of their defeat. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard the battleship Yamato, made the difficult decision to withdraw the entire combined fleet back to Japan. The operation that was supposed to eliminate American naval power in the Pacific had instead crippled his own forces. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's definitive history of United States naval operations. In World War II, the Japanese losses at Midway were catastrophic and irreplaceable. For fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser and over 300 aircraft had been lost, along with many of the Navy's most experienced pilots. The human cost was equally devastating. Admiral Nagumo's carrier striking force had lost over 2,500 men, including some of Japan's most skilled naval aviators. The pilots who had perfected their techniques in China and the early Pacific campaigns were gone forever, their expertise dying with them in the waters around Midway. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and should have commanded the Midway strike, was hospitalized with appendicitis during the battle. His post-war reflection captured the Japanese mood. The Kido Butai which had ranged over the Pacific for 6 months like an invincible force, was gone. We had lost the initiative and would never regain it. The strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted permanently. Japan, which had begun the war with 10 aircraft carriers, now possessed only for operational flat-tops. The United States, despite losing Yorktown, retained a growing industrial capacity that would soon produce carriers faster than Japan could sink them. The aftermath of the Battle of Midway sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure that reached all the way to the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito, receiving the initial reports from Admiral Yamamoto, struggled to comprehend how the nation's most powerful naval force had been so thoroughly defeated by an enemy they had underestimated. The task of explaining the disaster fell to Admiral Osamu Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, who found himself in the impossible position of briefing the emperor on Japan's first major defeat of the war. The meeting, held in the sacred precincts of the Imperial Palace, was conducted in the formal language of the court, but the message was devastatingly clear. The combined fleet had suffered a catastrophic defeat, from which it might never recover. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, learning of the defeat through military channels, immediately imposed a strict censorship on all news of the battle. The Japanese public, still celebrating the earlier victories at Pearl Harbor and the Dutch East Indies, would be told nothing of the disaster that had befallen their navy. The wounded survivors of the carrier crews were quarantined in isolated hospitals. To prevent word of the defeat from spreading, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, the Pearl Harbor strike leader who had missed the battle due to appendicitis, was among the first to recognize the true strategic implications. Writing in his private diary, he noted, "The backbone of the Imperial Navy's air power has been broken. The men who made Pearl Harbor possible are gone, and we cannot replace them." The American victory, meanwhile, was being celebrated with cautious optimism in Washington. President Franklin Roosevelt, briefed by Admiral Ernest King, understood that while Midway represented a crucial victory, the war was far from over. The Japanese still possessed significant naval forces, and their fanatical resistance would only intensify. As the conflict moved closer to their home islands, Admiral Chester Nimitz, the architect of the American victory, was characteristically modest in his assessment. Speaking to his staff at Pacific Fleet Headquarters in Pearl Harbor, he emphasized that intelligence and courage had combined to achieve the impossible. "We were outnumbered in every category except determination," he observed, "and that made all the difference." The codebreakers of Station HYPO, led by Commander Joseph Rockford, had provided the crucial intelligence that made the victory possible. Their penetration of the Japanese naval cipher JN-25 had given Nimitz complete knowledge of Japanese plans and timing. The victory at Midway was as much theirs as it belonged to the pilots who had pressed home their attacks with such devastating effect. The strategic consequences extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's carrier aviation program, which had taken years to develop, was effectively crippled. The training of new pilots would take months, and the construction of replacement carriers would require years that Japan could no longer afford. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical planner who had helped design the Pearl Harbor attack, was among the wounded evacuated from the burning Akagi. His injuries were severe, but his strategic mind remained sharp enough to recognize the magnitude of the defeat. "We have lost the war," he told his fellow officers during his recovery. Though it may take years for everyone to realize it, the industrial implications were equally significant. American shipyards, already operating at unprecedented capacity, would accelerate their production of aircraft carriers and support vessels. The Essex-class carriers, designed to incorporate lessons learned from early Pacific battles, would soon begin joining the fleet in numbers that would overwhelm Japanese defensive capabilities. As referenced in Gordon Prange's comprehensive study, Miracle at Midway, the battle represented a turning point not just in the Pacific War, but in naval warfare itself. The age of the battleship had ended decisively, replaced by the supremacy of carrier-based aviation that would dominate maritime conflicts. For decades to come, the Japanese plans, so carefully crafted and seemingly unstoppable, had indeed disintegrated. Under the weight of Midway's fierce air raids, American intelligence, and the courage of men who understood that the fate of democracy hung in the balance. Above the Pacific waves, the summer of 1942 marked a fundamental shift in the character of the Pacific War. As the full implications of the Midway disaster rippled through both Japanese and American strategic planning, the battle that had lasted only 3 days would influence military decisions for the remainder of the conflict, establishing patterns of victory and defeat that would define the final 3 years of the war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of both Pearl Harbor and the failed Midway operation, found himself in an impossible position. The combined fleet commander who had warned his superiors that Japan could only fight America for 6 months to a year had seen his prediction fulfilled in the most catastrophic manner possible. The window of opportunity had closed, and with it, any realistic hope of Japanese victory. The reconstruction of Japan's carrier aviation program began immediately, but faced insurmountable obstacles. The new pilots trained in accelerated programs that compressed years of instruction into months lacked the experience and skill of their predecessors. The veterans, who had perfected their techniques in China and the early Pacific campaigns, were irreplaceable. Their knowledge lost forever beneath the waves around Midway. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, recovering from his appendicitis, was assigned to help rebuild the shattered carrier air groups. His task was heartbreaking, attempting to recreate in months what had taken years to develop. The replacement pilots, eager and brave, simply could not match the precision and tactical awareness of the men who had made the Pearl Harbor attack possible. The American response was swift and decisive. The victory at Midway provided the psychological boost needed to launch offensive operations that had been impossible during the dark months following Pearl Harbor. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, immediately began planning for the invasion of Guadalcanal, the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. The industrial might of the United States, fully mobilized by the attack on Pearl Harbor, began producing weapons of war at rates that exceeded Japanese capacity by factors of 10 or more. The Essex-class aircraft carriers, each carrying twice the aircraft of their predecessors, would soon join the Pacific Fleet in numbers that would overwhelm Japanese defensive capabilities. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the hero of the Midway dive bombing attack, was promoted and assigned to train new pilots in the tactics that had proven so effective against the Japanese carriers. His emphasis on precision bombing and coordinated attacks would become standard doctrine for American naval aviation throughout the war.